Hello, everyone. Welcome to our wellness webinar. I would like to introduce Dr. Alaina Carr. She is a postdoctorate fellow at North Star Psychological Services. Dr. Carr is a clinical health psychologist at North Star Psychological Services in Washington, D.C., and practices under the supervision of Dr. Amy Carmico. Her clinical practice focuses on improving coping and adjustment for individuals diagnosed with chronic illness, autoimmune diseases, cancer, diabetes, and kidney disease, and their loved ones. She uses mindfulness, acceptance, and meaning making in her work with patients to help shift their perception of their identity from being overly tied to their chronic illness. Dr. Carr, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can go ahead and start.
Okay, great. So I am going to share my screen. I know you're not full, you're seeing my whole desktop, so bear with me for a moment. And quick question, are you all seeing the presenter view or are you seeing the full slides?
We're seeing the full slide.
Great. I love it when this happens. Okay. Hi, everyone. As Dova said, my name's Alaina Carr. You can refer to me as Alaina throughout this presentation. I'm really excited to be here today to partner with MGFA and talk about wellness in this wellness series. So a couple of things as we get started. What this talk is this talk is for educational purposes only. So we're really going to have a discussion here today about what it's like to live with a chronic illness and the different management strategies or adjustments you've made as you've navigated your own illness. So this talk is not supposed to be a replacement for any psychotherapy, mental health care, or medical care you currently receive. If you do end up having any questions about your medical care or different type of mental health approaches, that's something I would definitely defer to any treating provider that you have. So a little bit about my background. Dova gave a lovely introduction, a little bit more about me and my background is I'm a clinical health psychologist. So what that means is I really focus on how individuals cope and adjust to different health conditions they have. So that coping might be anywhere from time of diagnosis, during treatment, maybe into survivorship, or even at end of life. I've also worked with many family members as well because chronic illness not only impacts an individual, but it can also impact the family and friends. I also practice with in therapy with North Star Psychological Services based in DC. So I see many individuals for therapy there. And I'm also a researcher studying different types of cancer interventions for individuals at the Georgetown Lombardi Cancer Center. So I've worked with many individuals in my career that are currently diagnosed with cancer, chronic pain conditions, solid organ failure. So these are individuals that their kidney, liver, or lungs are no longer viable to work on their own. So they're up for transplants. Also, individuals with autoimmune disease. So I've worked with individuals with scleroderma and more recently, several individuals with myasthenia gravis, as well as heart disease. So I am by no means an expert in myasthenia gravis, but what brought me here today was I've been working with several individuals at the private practice, and I started noticing how unique this chronic disease is. So how I got involved with MGFA was I went to one of the MGFA community health events not too long ago in the DC area. And I was so struck when I came in, and really I came in just to gather more information about all of the patients that were there volunteering. So I remember going to one of the booths that they had, and they had an example of what it's like when you have changes in your vision. So you can really look through these glasses and get a sense of what it is to walk in the shoes of some patients with myasthenia gravis. Same thing with breathing. They had a station where they had a straw and you breathe through the straw, but there's a cotton ball at the end. So I was really struck by the investment that patients have in this community to come and be a part of this fair and share their experiences. So that's how I wound up here today. And I'm really excited to talk with you all, but also hear from your own experiences, what it's like to have this type of illness, and talk as a group about different ways we can think about having an illness that it might be lifelong. So since I work with many people from a lot of different types of illness backgrounds, I really want to hear from you throughout this entire talk as much as possible. So there is a chat feature. I'm going to ask that you use the chat feature with any questions or comments, and I'll also make sure to do lots of prompting too. And I have Dova here who will help field some of the questions in case I miss anything. So this is already an opportunity to use the chat feature. What I really want to hear from you is, since you were diagnosed with myasthenia gravis, in what areas of your life have you noticed changes? So there might be some of you on this talk today where maybe you're years into your illness journey, and then others in this talk who might recently have just received their diagnosis. So it doesn't matter where you are currently on your journey. I'm just curious what areas of your life have changed, and feel free to use the chat feature to just enter in these different things that you've noticed show up.
You guys don't have to be shy.
Yeah, no need to be shy. Oh, someone said chat is disabled. Is there a way to turn the chat on for everyone?
I'm going to try to turn on the chat, but they can go ahead and enter into the Q&A is working. So if you enter into the Q&A box, it's working. You can put your answers there.
So someone answered all three areas. In what ways have things changed for you physically? So we could start there. What are some physical areas you've noticed in your life that have changed? What are some emotional? What are some social areas? So someone wrote having to retire from my job. And emotional changes too. So I'm wondering, the person who had entered that, if you could say a little bit more about the emotional changes that you've experienced. And it can be very general too. Someone said, I just got diagnosed. I'm still getting used to medication, anxious about keeping up with my active family. Someone else said physical, I'm unable to drive. Huh.
The chat box is working now.
Great. Someone says, I'm so tired, I cannot work, socially excluded. Great. And physical, not working, had to retire, emotional. These are great. This is great that you all are able to really use this chat feature. Someone else said I had to retire from their job, especially with COVID. They had reduced physical activity, and some days they could only sit and plank. But there's improvement with the medication they're on. Okay, these are great. These are really great. Thank you so much for sharing the different experiences. So I have here some of the experiences that I tend to see with the different individuals that I work with. So a lot of changes in mobility. This idea of it being really hard to stand for long periods of time, sometimes even sit, difficulty walking, which can be really tough if you have a job or maybe you have a lifestyle where being physically mobile is really important to you. Same thing with eating and swallowing. I think there are some people that talked about different changes in those areas of their life. And you think about how much of a social piece is intertwined with that too, right? A lot of social connection can happen when we sit down for a meal, and how much that can change too if you're struggling with eating or swallowing. Someone had mentioned socially unable to engage in pre-planned get-togethers, especially if you're experiencing low energy. There were many people that also said changes in vision, it being really challenging to stare at a screen for a long period of time, to drive, many major areas of functioning that are changing. Then there's sleep and fatigue as well. And then there's a lot of emotional pieces that come into this as well. So it being really hard to adjust to this sense of what is my day-to-day life going to start to look like, especially as symptoms might change from day to day. So that can be met with feelings of frustration, maybe feeling overwhelmed. Oh my gosh, how am I going to do all of these things that are expected of me? How am I going to maintain my job? How am I going to make it to these doctor's appointments? How am I going to take these medications? Oh my gosh, this is just a lot at once. And then there can be fear as well that plays into it. So I don't know what the future holds for me. That makes me scared. And I often hear a lot of uncertainty too. We don't know what days we might be less symptomatic. We might not know what days we have the most energy. So it's really hard to sit with that uncertainty. And then social. So I'm seeing a lot of information in the chat, which is great. It sounds like you all are no longer feeling shy in this talk, which is great. I'm very excited that you all feel comfortable sharing your experiences already. So social activities, major changes where someone had mentioned having to pre-plan activities. Even if we pre-plan, it can be hard because we don't know if maybe all of a sudden we have muscle-related fatigue or any type of treatment-related fatigue showing up. Maybe there are differences showing up in terms of hobbies you used to enjoy. So myasthenia gravis, from what I know in working with patients with this condition, maybe you really enjoyed hobbies where there was a lot of physical activity involved. So maybe you were playing a sport. That might change depending on how much your body can handle any day, day to day. Someone had also mentioned intimacy and how intimacy can be a challenge. That can be another aspect too, where maybe there's emotional, social, and physical changes all happening at once. Maybe there's a change in the connection we feel with our loved ones as we're navigating our illness ourselves. And then isolation too. So it can be really challenging to want to get out and be social when you're experiencing all these things that we just talked about. Or maybe it might be hard to try and relate to friends or family members. There's many times where I've worked with patients and what I hear is, oh, I talk about my illness and then people don't know how to respond. So what ends up happening is I'm sitting there listening to, oh, my relatives, friends, mother-in-law had a similar situation happen to her, and this is what it is. And it kind of takes away from what your own experience is. Or it can just feel really invalidating in some ways where some people just don't know how to talk about it. And that can be hard as you're trying to manage it yourself. So when we think about all of these things, the bottom line is living with a chronic illness comes with a variety of feelings and thoughts. It is hard to live with this experience. It's very challenging. So it can be really tough when each individual's experience is unique. So one person with myasthenia gravis might have different symptoms than another person in this webinar right now. The way you walk your journey might be different from somebody else in this chat. But it's also normal to navigate both challenging and positive emotions when you're living with a chronic illness. So I also don't want to take away from this idea where there can be a lot of resiliency and growth in managing a long-term health condition. I know that one of the speakers at the MGFA annual talk last year had talked about there were a lot of patients that they interacted with, and there was a lot of growth and resiliency. So that can also be an experience. And at the same time, there can be all of these other emotions that you might feel at the same time. Yes, there might be growth. And at the same time, there might be uncertainty, there might be frustration, there might be anger. Everyone's experience is unique, and it's normal to have all of these feelings happen at once. So again, I want to use the chat feature as much as possible here. I want to know, how do you currently cope with these life challenges? So, and changes. So we talked about this idea of it being really hard to be social. It's hard to pre-plan activities. Maybe you feel limited due to fatigue or stamina. When those things show up in your day-to-day life, how do you currently cope with these life changes? I have some examples here on this slide, but again, it's really helpful to just hear from you all as a group. What sort of things do you do to cope? And these things can be things that are healthy coping strategies and things that might not be the best coping strategies, but a lot of this is different ways for us to learn from each other. So again, feel free to use the chat. Someone said, withdraw, they'll also pray, so spirituality. Someone said, I just deal with it. Learn to ask for help from family members. Counseling, self-care. Sit in nature, that's great. Watch movies. Take breaks whenever I can. It's great. So there are lots of different ways that we can try and cope with these challenges. So I've listed here different coping strategies that are both helpful and maybe not so helpful, but this is what I've commonly heard from people in the work that I've done. So when we think of sleep, there's a difference between feeling tired because maybe we're having muscle fatigue or daytime fatigue versus, oh, I'd rather not deal with this, so I'm going to go to bed to not deal with it. So there's a difference, right? So when I'm talking about sleep for coping, I'm talking about the latter more so. Or maybe we go to comfort foods. So maybe before your diagnosis or before these symptoms were showing up, getting a hamburger or fast food was a go-to. It just made all the problems go away in that moment. However, we also know that with different types of illnesses, what we eat can really have an impact depending on that illness. So maybe there are certain foods that cause more inflammation and we have to be very sensitive to that. So someone put ice cream with all exclamation points. I love it. Yes. So maybe in the short term, getting that bowl of ice cream when things just feel so overwhelming helps in that moment. However, what happens over time if that's our go-to, right? Maybe we have more inflammation, maybe we see more symptom flare-ups, maybe we get really tired over time. And when that happens, this is what I like to call a Band-Aid approach for coping with any type of illness that we may have. It might work in the short run, but in the long run, how is it serving you? How are you benefiting in the long run? So some coping strategies that we have mentioned, both in the chat and more of the adaptive ones, like attend your doctor's appointments, ask for help when you feel like you need help, be able to be honest with how you're feeling right now. If some of those strategies are working for you, that's great. Keep them, do not change them. However, when we talk about more of those Band-Aid approach coping strategies, those are some areas where we start to pause and think, all right, what happens when our coping strategies aren't really working for us in the long term? And what can be really tough when living with a chronic illness is there are two major challenges we may face. The first one is, how do we cope with practical challenges like following treatment recommendations, staying on top of your medication, going to the countless hospital appointments? And then how do we cope with the feelings that come with those challenges or even thoughts? So when we think about what happens when our coping strategies don't work for us, we feel stuck. So I'm interested to hear from you. Again, use the chat feature like you're doing already. In what ways do you feel stuck? So that could be feeling stuck with your thoughts and emotions as they relate to your illness. So someone said, I can't make plans. So maybe feeling stuck with you want to be social or you want to go out and do things, but you can't right now. Okay. Anyone else? Can't travel. Difficult to talk with people because it's such a difficult disease to understand. Yes. Stuck because friends never come around. Someone mentions stuck because I'm not the husband, father, worker that I used to be. So that example is one that I commonly see in the work that I do with patients. This idea of who I was before my diagnosis, or it maybe even the symptoms showed up, versus who I hope to be in the future, whether that's symptom-free or who I am right now. And it's this idea of this constant tug of war with yourself between, I used to be a father, I used to be the breadwinner, I used to be a productive person. That was who I was. And I'm so stuck in this idea of that's who I was, but with symptom flare-ups like having chronic fatigue, having pain, maybe experiencing difficulties seeing, you're not able to drive anymore. That's not where we are now. So someone says, I can't play with my grandmother. I miss doing motorcycle honor flight. A lot of things that you really think about this past version of yourself. So we get really fused to this idea of who I was versus who I am right now in this moment. And it's this constant battle, internal battle we have, where it's just constant tug of war. And the thing is, when you think of tug of war, there's normally a victor, right? So somebody wins out in the end. However, with this type of tug of war, we just get stuck. No one wins in the end. We don't go anywhere. So what do we do with that? How do you get unstuck? what if we just drop the rope? What if we just let go of the struggle? And that is very easy to say. It's very different to do. And someone just asked, how do you present focus and calm down all the thoughts? Great question. That's exactly what we're going to get to today. So it's great that some of you are already bringing these ideas, because I'm sure there's a lot of thoughts and feelings that are showing up as you are adjusting to these life changes. So the person who added that question to the group, I'm curious if there's a thought or a common feeling that shows up a lot for you. And you can keep it vague to make sure that you're not disclosing your identity or anything like that, or tailor it however you need. So as that person's sort of thinking, or other members of the group are more than welcome to share as well. I'll continue on. Oh, someone said frustration in the moment, that lost ability. Great. So focusing on the here and now, the present moment. So it can be very all-consuming when we keep getting stuck in these thoughts of who I was, what I was able to do. And it keeps taking us back either to the past or the future. And we keep missing out on the present, on your lived experience right now in this moment. So this idea of mindfulness is very popularized in the media. So I'm just curious from the group, what is sort of your understanding of what mindfulness is? Because I'd like us as a group to have a working definition of what it is moving forward as we continue this conversation of how to get unstuck. Anyone have a sense of what mindfulness is? Being aware of your thoughts, feelings, and self overall. Yeah, great. Health esteem, I love that. Health esteem, that's great. And someone said mindfulness has never worked for me. So this is all great. This is great areas for discussion. So when we think of mindfulness, it's really focusing on the here and now and staying in the present moment. So that involves non-judgmentally being aware of what you're experiencing in the here and now, the present moment. And that might be anywhere from mindful walking to just noticing what's showing up in your body, which can be really challenging. Someone said that mindfulness hasn't worked for them. That can be really challenging if you're experiencing pain, if you're having difficulty seeing, if you're having difficulty swallowing. So this is something that takes a little bit of time to really develop because it is really tough to just sit with what we're feeling, what we're experiencing in this moment and not have judgments about it, especially if we're fused to this thought of who I was with my functioning before. So moving forward from this working definition of mindfulness, that sense of we're non-judgmentally just acknowledging what's showing up for us now. Another way to think about it is we're also noticing our thoughts and feelings. And we're separating us from these thoughts and feelings. Someone said mindfulness is tricky because it's not a selfish thing. That's a great comment. And what about that makes it selfish? It's not a selfish thing. So what about that makes it less selfish, that you're just noticing what's showing up for you? So as this person keeps talking, we can't always focus on us. Yeah. So someone said, I don't think I know what you mean by mindfulness. So it's acknowledging what's showing up for you right now. So that might be tuning into your body and noticing that there are different sensations showing up. We're not getting overly fused to our mind wandering in any way. We're just noticing, okay, my mind's wandering. I'm coming back. It might be noticing different senses that are showing up in your body. And really just being aware of what's happening right now in this moment. We're not labeling it in any way. We're not saying what I'm doing is good or bad. It just is. And that can be really hard to practice and wrap your mind around. So another way to get unstuck is us creating space and acknowledging and being aware that difficult thoughts and feelings exist without trying to change them. So another way to think about this is if you have a thought that's showing up, like, let's think someone in the comments said, you're not able to be the parent, the spouse, the employee you used to be. You might ask yourself, is this thought useful? Is it helpful? What's the tone? Maybe what's the direction, temperature, or shape of this thought? Because it can be really easy to fall into these mind traps that we have where we start getting stuck and thinking, okay, because I'm no longer able to function how I was, therefore I'm a terrible spouse, I'm a terrible parent, I'm a terrible employee. But take a step back and ask yourself, is this helpful? If I were to imagine this thought as a cloud or some other type of object, what would the tone of it be? Is that maybe a thundercloud that's racing in the opposite direction? Is that a thundercloud where maybe lightning bolts are coming out and there's rain? Why would we want to start chasing that? How would that be useful? Or maybe another thing to think about is, how is buying into this thought or this story helpful for me? What does it do for me? So again, it's this feeling of, how do I slowly start working on getting unstuck? And then also do what matters, do what's important to you. So we're going to talk about this on the next slide. So when we say do what matters, we're really thinking about what's most important to you in life. So when we talk about this idea of values, values are what we think of in terms of who you want to stand for in life. So these are things that are what's the most important thing to you in life. Another way to think of it is it's your life's chosen direction. So oftentimes what I tend to see is this idea of family being such an important value. And as we think about this value, you can think of it almost like a compass, right? So we want to do things, behaviors or actions that are in line with that value of family. So some things to keep in mind are values are things that you do in the here and now, the present moment, and they're ongoing. So they're never meant to be achieved. They're things that we work in line with. And they also help us live rich and meaningful lives. So these are things that are really important to prioritize, which can be tough when there's a lot of other noise going on in our lives, especially when you think about symptoms or any challenges with managing illness. So what aren't values? Values aren't goals. So goals are something that's achievement oriented. They can be completed. They're time bound. Also, values aren't internal states or feelings. So a value isn't, I want to be happy. I want all of my symptoms to go away. Those aren't values. An example I like to use is, you know, when it's New Year's, after New Year's, and everyone has these New Year's resolutions. So some of them might be, oh, I really want to exercise a ton and lose a bunch of weight. Well, that's something that's achievement oriented, right? There's an end date to that. However, if we think about how that could be a value, maybe it's more so my health is really important to me. How my body is feeling, how my mental, emotional, and physical health is, that's really important to me. So some things I'm going to do day to day will be go out for a walk for 5 minutes. I'm not going to go sign up for these gym memberships and work out on the treadmill a ton. Doesn't work for me. But going out and walking is in line with that value. Or eating a healthy meal in line with that value. Spending time with my family, that's emotional health, in line with the value. They're ongoing. They're lifelong things that we work towards, but we never achieve. So I have an exercise as we talk about all these different ideas. And I really want to hear from you. What are your values? So this is an exercise I often use with patients that I see in the therapy I do, where these are different life domains. So you can see there's work and education, there's leisure, relationships, personal growth, and health. So values can be any working definition that you create. They're personal. So this isn't the all-encompassing list of values, but this is just a helpful exercise to get more of a sense of what I'm talking about. And someone just said to be kind. That's great. It's what's most meaningful to you, what helps you thrive in life, despite all of these things that come with having an illness. What's keeping you going? What's helping you thrive to be the person that you want to be? So to be kind, that's great. And with this exercise, you can think about some of these different values that might fall in these domains. So if leisure is a value for you, that could be relaxing, engaging in activities. Someone said learning, right? Lifelong learner. There's also relationships. So to raise good humans is another one. So, right. So that idea of family connection, that idea of motherhood, someone put peace. So there are all these different areas where your values can emerge. And when we think about doing this exercise, if you look at these different values, I want you to think about putting an X in the area of this dartboard that represents where you are right now and how you're living in line with that value. So you can see the closer you get to the bullseye in this exercise is the more in line you are with that value. Whereas the farther away you get, the less in line you are with that value. And this can be helpful if you really think about what's the most important value to you and where do you fall, because some values might not have as much priority. So it might be okay if it's falling farther out. So for the person that said to be kind, or the person who said peace or parenthood, where would that X be on this bullseye? Is it closer to the middle? Is it a little farther away? So I'll just have the people in the webinar take a couple minutes to think about where you would put that X. And is there anything that's surprising about where that X fell? So does anyone have any reflections about where their X fell in terms of the bullseye? So sometimes what I see in the work that I do is if relationships, so your family is the most important thing, sometimes the X comes farther away from the bullseye because different things might be getting in the way or taking you away from that value. So those things might be overly sleeping, to not talk about your illness. Again, it's not sleeping because of fatigue related to the illness, but as a way to avoid those uncomfortable feelings. And also might be deciding to isolate because you just don't want to get on that phone call with friends or family. And over time, what happens is we get farther away from what's most important to us, who we're most trying to be. And when this happens, we might notice more of those difficult emotions showing up. Maybe that creates more feelings of sadness or feeling more worried or anxious. And it's a very common experience to sometimes work closer towards the bullseye. And then there might be other times of your life where you're a little bit farther away. It's not a one direction. In the human experience, we're constantly working on asking ourselves, is this in line, or are these behaviors of mine in line with what's most important to me? What's most meaningful to me in life? So I love this quote by Viktor Frankl, who talks about this idea that we may never forget that we may find meaning in life, even when confronted with a hopeless situation, when facing a fate that cannot be changed. For what then matters is how to bear witness to the uniquely human potential at its best, which is to transform a personal tragedy into a triumph, to turn one's predicament into a human achievement. When we are no longer able to change a situation, such as an inoperable cancer, we are challenged to change ourselves. So, in other words, one of the guarantees in life is that part of the human experience is pain and suffering. And we, despite knowing that that's part of human experience, how do we continue to thrive in life or do what's most meaningful to us? And this very much so echoes the experience of living with a chronic illness. That pain and suffering might be more of the symptoms you experience from that illness. It might also be some of the emotional challenges that can be fused with this idea of my life looks different now. My life looks different day to day. So what do I do if I can't change some of those things? So when I say change, I mean we can't change moment to moment if we're experiencing a lot of fatigue. we might not be able to change that. So we can change ourselves. We can change how we interact with that. And that's where this idea that we've talked about of mindfulness comes in, really trying to create space for these difficult emotions or thoughts, and then really bringing us back to what's most important, what's most meaningful to us right now. And if that's family, if that's connection, if that's learning, what are the things I'm doing day to day that are at least somewhat in line with that? That doesn't mean you have to get a library card for learning and read all the books in the library. It might be reading an article, reading a couple pages in a book. That's in line with that value. The other thing I want to talk about, again, in line with this mindfulness idea, is how we can engage in mindful pacing. So there are some things that we still need to do day to day, and that could be household chores, that could be activities related to work, that could be enjoyable activities. But for this example, I'm going to use fatigue. So there might be some things where we still need to get certain activities done. And for this example, I'm going to use this idea of household chores, so doing laundry. So there's different ways we can be mindful and pace ourselves as we're engaging in day-to-day activities. So something that I really like to recommend to people I work with is right before you begin to start the activity, I want you to notice what your fatigue level is before you start. So I always joke, psychologists, we just love our 1 to 10 scales. But these could be really helpful. So if you were to think right before you start doing the laundry, what's my fatigue level right now on that 1 to 10 scale, with 1 being no fatigue and 10 being the most fatigue? What you would do is give yourself an internal rating in your mind. And as you're engaging in that activity, being very aware and paying attention to how your fatigue level is changing. So when I work with patients, oftentimes what I hear is, I get so exhausted carrying the laundry up the stairs, taking it to the laundry machine, bending over, picking up the laundry, putting it in the washer. And by the time I even just do that, I'm worn out. So if we think about that, maybe we're engaging in this activity, but you notice, okay, maybe I've gotten halfway done or even less than that. If your fatigue level goes up by 2 points, so if you're putting the laundry from the wash or the laundry bin into the washing machine, and you're now saying, oh my gosh, my fatigue's a 7, but when I started, I was at a 4. That's a sign to stop. Right now, your body's telling you, I'm tired. If I keep pushing myself, I might get really tired later on. So let me just stop. I'm going to switch to go to a different activity that won't use as much energy. And I'm going to come back when my energy level goes back to that 4. And then I'll keep going. And what this does is it can be really helpful for changing this dynamic that I often see with patients who are managing energy or even pain. Is we have these roller coaster experiences where we have more energy, or maybe we have days with less pain, and we do as much as we can, and then we crash for a few days. And when we do this, what happens is that roller coaster becomes smaller. We're slowly finding ways to pace ourselves, and our body can start adjusting. So this is one of those additional strategies to kind of have in your back pocket as you're navigating more of the day-to-day. So someone had mentioned in the chat that they didn't see therapy as a part of the strategy. And the type of things we're talking about today is a type of therapeutic practice. And it's rooted in this idea of acceptance and commitment therapy. So like I said at the start of this talk, this is one out of many different approaches to manage a chronic illness. So for those of you who maybe resonated with more of this idea of this is something where I'll be working on it lifelong, just like values are lifelong, ACT very much so takes on that same type of perspective. In life, we're always working on being who we want to be. We're always working towards finding different ways to thrive in life, find meaning in life, despite knowing that suffering is also a part of that experience. So I have a bunch of resources here that I like to share with patients that I work with. And some are different mindfulness resources. So you can see here the free mindfulness resources. And there are a couple of reminders that I like to bring to people's attention as they get started on this. So every time you engage in mindfulness, it's a different experience. There are people that have been practicing mindfulness for years, decades, and every time they engage in it, it's different. So the other thing to keep in mind, our minds are made to think. They are made to wander. So if you sit down and decide to engage in mindfulness and you notice, oh my gosh, my mind's wandering. I'm thinking about what I need to do, all of these things. Guess what? Your mind's meant to wander. It's doing what it's built to do. So when we engage in mindfulness, let's not judge our mind for doing that. We just thank our mind for coming back. And knowing that maybe the next time you engage in the practice, your mind might wander less, it might wander more. It's just different, and that's okay. So I also recommend, if you're starting mindfulness practice, to start with shorter mindfulness exercises first. So when I say shorter, I mean 5 or 3 minutes or less. There can be a lot of different stereotypes about what mindfulness practice is. Maybe you think somebody's sitting on a mountaintop and just meditating for 45 minutes. If you haven't done something like that before, that's going to feel like an eternity to do that. So let's not do that. Let's try 3 minutes and just see what that experience is like. Someone said, when I do mindfulness, I just remember the fact that I'm trying mindfulness. The other thing might be, maybe sitting with your eyes closed is tough. So there can be mindful movements. So sometimes mindfulness can be being mindful of when you take a sip of water or when you eat. Or sometimes, depending on your energy level, if you really like walking, you can walk for about 4 minutes and try the mindfulness. But experiment a little bit. And then Dove, I see you just came on. I want to say one thing about the resources before I turn it back over. So for those of you who are at different points in your journey with your illness, there are many therapists out there that know how to work with individuals who have illnesses. Again, this idea of clinical health psychologists. So I recommend Psychology Today to find someone. You can type in your zip code, you can type in what type of health condition you have, and then your insurance to find someone that is in your network. There's also ACT therapists, this whole association in a directory for therapists that do the type of concepts we talked about today. There's also a whole board of professional psychologists that are clinical health psychologists. There's a directory here. And then everyone's experiences are different with the symptoms they experience. but also they might be different in terms of the way we identify or the type of cultural background we have. So here's a list of resources here for therapists that are competent in these areas and ways people identify, because that also can change how you interact with the healthcare system. It can also change how you interact with how you manage these types of illnesses. And then just a little thank you. Would not be here giving this talk today if I didn't hear from every single patient, family member, or friend that shared their illness journey with me. So I thank everyone who was able to share and use the chat features. I also want to thank Dova for letting me be a part of this talk today, and then my supervisor, Dr. Karamiko. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Alaina. This was great. I think it gives people a lot of things to think about, for sure. I am just going to share my screen for one quick second. I just want to say again, thank you to Dr. Carr. I also want to thank our sponsors, Alexian, Argenix, UCB, Horizon, Janssen, and Cabaleto Bio for helping us put on these webinars. Thank you again. If anyone has any further questions, you're welcome to email them in to us, and we will get Dr. Carr to take a look at them. I'm sure she'll be happy to answer them, and we'll send them by email.
Absolutely.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much and have a good day.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.